All right, folks, it's time to respond to this Anderson Cooper segment on 60 Minutes. Anderson Cooper has filed his swan song with 60 Minutes, harping on a media and South African political phrase to dismiss genuine issues in South Africa in a very one-sided affair. The segment is littered with incorrect statements and misleading setups, as well as including apologists for the ANC and one-sided narrative with victims of farm attacks. Now that said, some of it's accurate and actually objective. Unfortunately, Cooper begins with the nonsense the ANC and South Africa's media has used to dismiss the intentional targeting of South Africans to drive them off of land. Most likely because they're mostly white, and that just will not fit the media's misinformation narrative. Now, one of my viewers succinctly described what they're up to, the media, including Anderson Cooper. And it's right out of Saul Alinsky and the Soviet Union's playbook. You see, they grasp onto the term genocide to use as a standard straw man argument. How? Well, you dishonestly attribute a weak argument to your adversary, white genocide, destroy it like a heroic Don Quixote, and claim victory, and ignore the opponent's real arguments, which is what's happening here. That's exactly what Anderson Cooper does throughout the 60-minute segment. He ignores the real argument, just skips right around it to fabricate a story that misleads the viewer who doesn't know any better. In this case, the real argument is the intentional targeting of white South Africans. Now, I don't know what was left on the cutting room floor, but what Anderson Cooper included in his segment in an interview with Daryl Brown, the KZN farmer who erected the white crosses after the brutal farm slaying of Glenn and Vita Rafferty, does not come across well. Daryl Brown served, with or without his consent, as a clever 60 Minutes prop to casually dismiss the brutal targeted torture and slaughter of farming families, owing to Trump's misstatement last year in May in the Oval Office regarding the crosses that Brown had erected to honor those murdered. Trump mistakenly called them burial plots. Something looking at it, you could see obviously weren't burial plots unless people were planted in the ground along a road sideways. Now, it's something the media, especially here in the United States, glommed onto, completely ignoring the 1,000 crosses representing 1,000 real people, real South Africans, genuinely murdered on farms. And that was just a fraction of the total number of those who have been murdered. Daryl Brown even said in the interview that they represented murder victims. Yet, as per the norm, Cooper moved right along, never once asking about the crosses themselves or the victims. He then moved right to the survivors of a farm attack. The widow who appears in the 60 Minutes segment also appeared in Anderson Cooper's Leafy Riefenstahl-like propaganda documentary, Misinformation, White Genocide, that appeared just before or on the eve of the G20 summit. She once again, as she did there, described the murder of her husband as a robbery by opportunistic attackers. Now, she may very well be correct, but she can only speak to her experience, not to the thousands of others. Anderson Cooper makes no effort to find the flip side of this coin, pretending that it doesn't even exist. Then Cooper goes on to perpetuate the long-existing lie about land ownership. But I'll give him credit. At least the lies these days include more accurate information. Specifically, he falsely claimed that whites own 72% of all privately held agricultural land. How could he possibly know that? What's the most recent data that provides that information? There is no recent data, and things have changed. In 2017, based on data the government itself provided, there were 37,078,289 hectares of land that was considered farms or agricultural holdings. In 2017, 9 years ago, white South Africans did hold 26,663,144 hectares, or 72% of what the government considered to be commercial farmland. That was a decade ago. And remember, much of that commercial farmland is grazing land in the Karoo. Things have changed significantly since then. White South Africans do not own 72% of farmland. Regardless, the whole argument is a red herring in the first place. Farm ownership is not why poverty is widespread in South Africa. Failed macroeconomic redistribution and dependency policies, as well as pervasive corruption, patronage, incompetence, criminality, and racist policies are at fault. That's for the economic disparity in South Africa that he wants to talk about, referring to the Gini coefficient and how it's one of the most unequal countries in the world. But unequal doesn't mean poverty. The poverty is a consequence of the policies and the behavior of the ruling government, not of farm ownership. And moving right along, Wandile Silobo appears in the segment shilling for the ANC, at least it appears he is. He says there are farm murders, and they affect black as well as white farmers. No kidding. Really? I've been reporting on this for years. He said a lot of black farmers are attacked and they are ignored. Perhaps by you, Wandile, but not by me. And there's a big difference between attacks on black farmers and farm workers and white South Africans on farms. Yes, black South Africans are attacked and even murdered, and I've reported on that. But they're almost never tortured or dismembered, which is all too often the case with white farmers. And nobody scrawls in blood on the walls of a farmhouse, "Kill the Boer," when they murder black South Africans on farms. Now next up is Johan Kutza, the CEO of Agra SA, a major agricultural farming organization that goes out of its way to intentionally avoid antagonizing the African National Congress government, usually at the expense of the farming community. He says 37 farmers killed out of 25,000 murders last year. It's about criminality. If only that were true. The actual number of farm murders is higher owing to SAPs covering up farm murders. I can say this with no reservation whatsoever. Last year, SAPs covered up a murder of a 70-plus-year-old farmer near Brits by falsely claiming it was a house robbery. That's what the police report said. But we know that the farmer was tied up along with his wife, tortured for hours, beaten while tied to a wheelchair after having a hip operation, and left for dead, finally succumbing to his wounds a few days later. This is after, on 3 consecutive nights, first they poisoned and murdered his dogs, so they had no early warning. The next night they stole the front and rear wheel of his truck, so he couldn't escape. And then they came for the family. If it was simply a robbery, why didn't they just come and steal things? What are a 70-year-old man and his late 60s-year-old wife going to do to stop you if it's just a robbery? Now, Anderson Cooper then makes the following silly statement. Well, that's what's happening on farms. That's what's happening in Johannesburg. Streets, it's crime. And Kutza's response, it's crime. In the first quarter of 2025, they reported 6 homicides on farms. 5 victims were black. Only that's factually incorrect. The SAPS data does not include the farm murders falsely reported as house robberies like the murder I just talked about of a septuagenarian near Brits last year. Cooper then claims 1% of white South Africans live in poverty. Jeez. Again, out-of-date information. The 1% figure is a bogus data point bandied about by the captured South African Human Rights Commission in a 2017-2018 report relying on 2011 data. It was already nearly a decade old when they used the data. Now it's 2026, not 2011. Also, apparently, Anderson Cooper wasn't informed about the recent UCT study talking about the 75,000 Rand per household as middle income, and mentioning the fact that white households in 2014, 61% of them were middle income or higher. Today, only 41% of them reach the middle income or higher threshold, meaning that nearly half of the white population has been pushed lower on the economic ranks. And that's not mentioned. So do they have to fall into the point where they have no income before you actually talk about it? And then, of course, comes the obligatory leftist history of apartheid. But no mention of ANC rule, which is rapidly approaching the historical length of apartheid, 32 years. Cooper falsely claims that the people elected Nelson Mandela in 1994. Nope. Parliament selected him. The people didn't vote for Nelson Mandela. Nobody voted for him to be president or any president in South Africa. It's a parliamentary system. And then yet again, as his shameful documentary previously did, he tosses in an irrelevant segment on white supremacist footage from the United States, a group I've never even heard of. Yeah, what is that? It's an intentional effort by a media house to undermine the argument, going back to the point that my viewer talked about. And the coup de grace. He invites communist Max Dupree in for his views. Oh, what does Max have to say? Well, Max says that Donald Trump was fed this information, that he himself has never been discriminated against. Well, of course not. Max, you're a commie. They take care of their own. They love you, commies. They're not going to hurt you. At this stage, Anderson Cooper actually stumbles back into factual reporting. He gets some of the story correct, like explaining the difference between expropriation without compensation and eminent domain in the United States. And then he even gives Kali Creel a fair hearing, letting him clarify the term white genocide. But then we're back to Max. Max Dupree falsely claims that the refugee program shows these white Afrikaner refugees are more important than bona fide refugees from elsewhere in the world. They are saying white lives are worth more than other lives. Nope, Max, not even remotely true. Why don't you tell that to the coloreds, the Indians, and the black South Africans who have arrived in America as refugees under this program, Max? Of course you won't, because you'll deny the truth, as does Anderson Cooper. saying that the program is for white Afrikaners. He said so at the outset. Finally, it's back to Farmer Brown, Darryl Brown in KZN. His closing comment in this documentary or segment of 60 Minutes is, "I am an African." To which I say to Farmer Brown, "Sir, I concur 100%. You are an African. It's a shame the government of South Africa doesn't feel the same way towards you. You're not an African. Only blacks are Africans, according to the government of South Africa. They never consider you an African, even though your family has been there longer than many of the recent migrants who've come in there from elsewhere around the continent." So, Anderson Cooper got a few things right, but his date is out of date, and he doesn't tell you that, so that's dishonest. I tell you where the data comes from and the date of the data, which makes it highly unreliable 9 years later. It's a baseline, but it's not accurate. And to use it as a point to influence tens of millions of people into believing a narrative that Anderson Cooper, CBS, and the mainstream media want you to believe is intellectually dishonest. It's morally bankrupt. So, I don't take a lot of exception to what he did here. I'm not even remotely surprised. I saw Misinfo Nation, the white genocide documentary that Donnie O'Donnell put together. I participated in the process, and I know how CNN operates. CBS doing the same thing here. Shame on them. No objectivity whatsoever. No discussion with a family on the flip side of the family who say it's just opportunistic criminals. No one who talks about how a family member was tortured, raped, slaughtered, beaten for hours, called filth, called dogs, attacked. No discussion of that. And instead of talking to an actual authoritative figure on what's happening on farms, like Theo de Jager, they go to the big industrial conglomerate, Agri-SA's Johan Kotze. Objectivity would have included Theo de Jager as well. I don't know what to tell you, folks. This is what the media does. Just like the fake documentary Vox put out a few years ago showing images of Cape Town and informal settlements and how it's unfair that upscale neighborhoods are next to them. Well, there was no settlement there. An upscale neighborhood was built, and then people illegally occupied and stole land and built it next to it. It doesn't represent wealth disparity. It represents criminality. Those people had a home elsewhere and came there and built those shacks and slums, and the government allowed it. But hey, that's Vox. They got millions of viewers. We try to get by with what we've got. Shame on CBS. Just another sad, misleading segment. And for this dishonest about what's happening in South Africa, it makes a cogent, lucid person ask themselves, what have they been lying to us about in all the other segments for the past 50 years? And that's how 60 Minutes ends. And so does my segment. Cheers.